February 14, 1943. The Tunisian desert is bitterly cold. A howling wind sweeps through the jagged defiles of the Fade Pass, carrying the fine, blinding sand of the Sahara. In the pre-dawn darkness, the silence of the North African frontier is suddenly broken by a low, mechanical growl. It is a sound the British have learned to fear, but one the newly arrived Americans have never truly heard. The heavy steel tracks of German Panzer Kampfwagen IVs grind against the desert floor. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, battle-hardened and ruthless, surges through the morning mist. Waiting for them in the valley below at Sidi Bouzid are the men of the United States the Second Corps. They are farm boys, factory workers, and city clerks clad in olive drab. They are well-fed, heavily equipped, and entirely untested in the brutal reality of modern mechanized warfare. The German commanders peering through their field glasses do not see a peer military force. They see amateurs. The looming slaughter will confirm every German suspicion, setting the stage for a violent baptism by fire that forces a rapid fundamental transformation of the American war machine. November 8, 1942, Operation Torch. An armada of over 800 warships and transports slices through the black swells of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. It is the largest amphibious invasion the world has yet seen. Under the command of a relatively unknown American general named Dwight D. Eisenhower, over 100,000 Allied troops pour onto the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. Their mission is to secure French North Africa, squeeze the Axis forces from the west, and open a second front to relieve the battered Soviets. The initial resistance comes from Vichy French forces. It is brief, politically complex, and ultimately successful. The Americans achieve their beachheads. The mood is triumphant. But this early victory is a dangerous illusion. To understand the impending disaster, one must understand the American soldier of 1942. Just 3 years prior, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world, boasting a fighting force smaller than that of Portugal. The eruption of the Second World War triggered a frantic, unprecedented mobilization. The arsenal of democracy roared to life, churning out millions of uniforms, rifles, and vehicles. Millions of young men were drafted from the wheat fields of Kansas, the assembly lines of Detroit, and the crowded streets of Brooklyn. They were marched through the humid swamps of Louisiana and the baking sands of California in massive war games. But training is a sterile environment. You cannot manufacture combat experience on an assembly line. The men who step onto the shores of North Africa are green. They are heavily equipped, thoroughly vaccinated, and exceptionally well fed. But they have never heard the terrifying snap of a bullet, breaking the sound barrier past their ears. They carry an inherent, distinctly American swagger, a deeply ingrained belief that the sheer weight of their industrial might, combined with natural grit, will easily crush the fascists. They trust their equipment implicitly. They drive the M3 Stuart light tank, a fast vehicle they affectionately call the Honey, and the towering M3 Lee, a strange, multi-tiered tank with a hull-mounted gun. They believe these machines are the finest in the world. They are fundamentally mistaken. Across the Mediterranean, waiting in the harsh terrain of Tunisia, is an entirely different breed of soldier. The German Wehrmacht in late 1942 is the most lethal, highly synchronized military organization in human history. These men are not recent civilians. They are hardened killers. They have crushed Poland, swept through the Low Countries, humiliated the French army in a matter of weeks, and survived the frozen, apocalyptic meat grinder of the Eastern Front. In North Africa, the men of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps have spent 2 years mastering the brutal intricacies of desert warfare. They know the paralyzing heat, the blinding dust storms, and the geometry of open-ground armored combat. To the veteran German officer, war is an exact, unforgiving science. Their Panzer Divisions operate with terrifying fluidity, utilizing combined arms tactics that seamlessly integrate tanks, mechanized infantry, and devastating artillery fire. They communicate constantly via two-way radios, adjusting their formations on the move. German tank commanders lead from the front, standing with their heads out of the cupolas, reading the flow of battle with their own eyes. They possess the dreaded 88mm flak gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft duty, but now employed as the most feared anti-tank weapon on the battlefield, capable of punching through American armor from a mile away before the Americans even know they are under attack. When intelligence reports filter back to Berlin and to Rommel's headquarters, detailing the arrival of the Americans, the German reaction is a mixture of curiosity and profound dismissal. Intercepted radio traffic reveals American units broadcasting in the clear, violating basic operational security. German reconnaissance units observe American columns bunching up on the roads, presenting perfect targets for artillery and airstrikes. To the battle-scarred German high command, the Americans look like heavily armed children playing a deadly game they do not begin to comprehend. As winter sets in, the Allies push eastward toward the mountains of Tunisia. The strategy is to trap the Axis forces against the British 8th Army, which is relentlessly advancing from Egypt. The United States, the Second Corps, acting as the vanguard in the center, stretches its supply lines across hundreds of miles of austere terrain. The Atlas Mountains loom before them, a bleak, jagged landscape of narrow gorges, treacherous passes, and freezing rain. Here, in the shadow of these ancient peaks, the illusion of an easy war will be violently stripped away. The untested American doctrine is on a direct collision course with a desperate, cornered, and deeply experienced enemy. By January 1943, the Allied advance stalls. The battlefield shrinks to a harsh mountainous bottleneck in Tunisia, defined by two parallel ridges, the eastern and western dorsales. Between them lies a barren, wind-scoured valley. Whoever controls the narrow, rocky passes through these mountains controls the flow of the war. Commanding the United States, the Second Corps, is Major General Lloyd Fredendall. He is a man who looks the part of a general, speaking with a loud, aggressive bluster. But behind the bravado is a commander crippled by paranoia and a fundamental misunderstanding of mechanized warfare. Instead of leading from the front, Fredendall orders an entire engineer company to blast a massive, bomb-proof underground bunker deep into a ravine near Tebessa. It is located 70 miles behind the front lines. He rarely leaves this subterranean command post. From the safety of this concrete tomb, he issues convoluted orders over the radio, using a bizarre, personal slang that leaves his frontline officers completely baffled. Fredendall entirely ignores the core principle of armored warfare, massing your forces. Instead, he scatters the American troops in isolated defensive pockets. He places infantry on remote hilltops and disperses his armor in small, unsupported clusters across the valley floor. The units are too far apart to provide mutual covering fire. They are blind, immobilized, and waiting for a blow they cannot see coming. Erwin Rommel sees the fatal flaw immediately. The Desert Fox recognizes that the American lines are overextended, static, and poorly positioned. He prepares to strike. On the morning of February 14, 1943, Operation Frulling's Wind Spring Breeze begins. Under the cover of a howling sandstorm, the 10th and 21st Panzer Division slam into the scattered American positions at Sidi Bouzid. The assault is a masterpiece of German tactical precision. Panzers execute perfect pincer movements, bypassing the entrenched American infantry on the high ground and slicing directly into the vulnerable armor and supply lines below. The American response is brave but tragically naive. Tank commanders of the 1st Armored Division charge their M3 Stuarts and M3 Lees directly at the German formations, expecting a traditional cavalry clash. Instead, they drive into a meticulously constructed trap. Hidden German 88mm guns open fire from a mile away. The high-velocity shells slice through the thin American armor like paper. When the Americans do manage to close the distance, Their 37mm tank guns simply bounce off the thick frontal plating of the Panzer IVs. Within hours, the American counterattacks are utterly decimated. Entire tank battalions vanish in clouds of oily black smoke. The survivors are forced into a chaotic, desperate retreat. The withdrawal quickly devolves into a rout. The roads leading west are choked with burning jeeps, abandoned half-tracks, and terrified, exhausted men fleeing the unrelenting German pursuit. By February 19th, Rommel's forces reach the western dorsale. They set their sights on a narrow, vital gap in the mountains, the Kasserine Pass. Defending the pass is a disorganized amalgamation of American engineers, untested infantry, and fragmented armored units. They are demoralized and shivering in the freezing torrential rain. When the Afrika Korps attacks, the defense crumbles. German infantry scale the steep cliffs flanking the pass under the cover of darkness, raining machine gun fire and mortar down onto the trapped Americans. The panzers push through the valley floor, shattering the remaining roadblocks. The Americans break. They abandon their weapons, their vehicles, and their positions, fleeing miles to the rear in sheer panic. The defeat at Kasserine Pass is absolute. In a matter of days, the United States II Corps suffers over 6,000 casualties. Hundreds of pristine American tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces are left smoldering in the desert or captured intact by grinning German mechanics. The battlefield is a graveyard of American steel and American confidence. To the German officers surveying the wreckage, the conclusion is obvious. The United States military is vastly inferior, incapable of surviving the brutal realities of a real war. To the German officers surveying the wreckage, the conclusion is obvious. The United States military is vastly inferior, incapable of surviving the brutal realities of a real war. They walk among the burning husks of American armor in the Kasserine Valley, smoking captured Lucky Strike cigarettes and marveling at the sheer volume of abandoned supplies. The enemy angle in February 1943 is one of supreme, validated arrogance. Erwin Rommel, writing dispatches back to Berlin, describes the American troops as completely green, sluggish, and tactically rigid. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, is even more dismissive. To the battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht, these Americans are not soldiers, they are tourists in uniform. The German infantrymen loot the sprawling American supply dumps with genuine astonishment. They uncover mountains of canned peaches, powdered eggs, real coffee, and pristine medical kits. The sheer logistical wealth of the United States is staggering, entirely alien to a German army already suffering from severe supply shortages. Yet, this material abundance only deepens their contempt. Wealth, they reason, cannot buy combat instinct. They observe that American infantry break easily under concentrated mortar fire. They note that American radio operators broadcast in plain English, allowing German intelligence to map their exact movements hours in advance. The Afrika Korps operates with a ruthless, silent efficiency born of years in the desert, while the Americans blunder through the canyons like a blind giant. The Germans smile because they believe the arsenal of democracy has produced a soft, unteachable army. That perceived softness is intrinsically tied to the technological angle. The equipment the Americans brought to North Africa is mechanically reliable but conceptually obsolete for the modern anti-tank battlefield. The American armored doctrine of the 1930s designated tanks primarily for exploiting breakthroughs and supporting infantry, not for fighting other tanks. This deeply flawed philosophy leaves the frontline GI dangerously outgunned. The standard American light tank, the M3 Stuart, is fast and easy to maintain. The British call it the honey for its smooth ride. But in the stark geometry of desert warfare, speed is irrelevant when your weapon cannot penetrate the enemy. The Stuart is armed with a small 37mm gun. Against the frontal armor of a German Panzer, the 37mm shell simply shatters on impact. American tank crews report closing to within point-blank range, firing directly into the sides of German armor, only to watch their rounds bounce harmlessly off into the desert sky. When the Americans deploy their medium armor, the M3 Lee, the design flaws are even more fatal. The Lee is a towering, unnatural silhouette on the flat desert horizon, making it an impossibly easy target. Worse, its main 75mm cannon is mounted low in the hull, rather than in a fully rotating turret. To fire at an enemy, the M3 Lee must expose its entire massive hull over a ridgeline. By the time the American gunner acquires a target, a German shell is already tearing through the crew compartment. The apex predator of this theater is not a tank at all. It is the German 88mm Flak 36, originally designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers. German commanders recognized its potential against ground targets during the invasion of France. By 1943, it is the most terrifying weapon in the Axis arsenal. It fires a high-velocity, armor-piercing shell on a perfectly flat trajectory. It can punch clean through the engine block of an American tank from over 2,000 yards away. Because the shell travels faster than the speed of sound, the American crew never hears the gunfire. There's only a sudden catastrophic kinetic impact, followed by the screams of men trapped inside a burning steel coffin. The technological disparity leaves the American soldier entirely exposed, relying on flawed leadership to navigate a battlefield where mistakes are instantly fatal. The battlefield where mistakes are instantly fatal demands commanders who understand the terrain, the enemy, and the absolute limits of their own men. In the American camp, this leadership is catastrophically absent. The leadership angle reveals a stark, almost theatrical contrast between the opposing generals. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commands the United States the Second Corps, not from the bleeding edge of the front line, but from a heavily fortified, subterranean bunker, blasted into the solid rock of a ravine near Tebessa. A full engineer company spent weeks constructing this bomb-proof shelter. He is geographically and psychologically completely detached from the grim reality of the fighting. When he issues orders over the radio, he refuses to use standard military grid coordinates. Instead, he invents a confusing personal slang, ordering units to secure the place that begins with a C or commanding his armor to go smash him. His subordinate officers are left completely baffled, desperately trying to decipher vague, amateurish instructions, while German panzers bear down on their exposed positions. Fredendall arbitrarily divides his forces, micromanages platoon-level defenses from 70 miles away, and fundamentally fails to grasp the fluid, high-speed nature of desert combat. Across the frozen mud and burning steel of the Kasserine Valley, Erwin Rommel dictates the flow of battle from the open hatch of a forward command half-track. The Desert Fox operates on an instinct honed by years of relentless warfare. He firmly believes a commander must feel the friction of the front line, breathe the cordite, and see the geometry of the engagement with his own eyes. Where Fredendall dilutes his strength across isolated hilltops, Rommel concentrates his armor into a massive, heavy fist, the Schwerpunkt designed to punch through the weakest point in the enemy line. The German leadership structure empowers junior officers to take immediate, violent initiative without waiting for permission from a bunker miles away. This doctrinal superiority translates into a paralyzing operational speed that the rigid American command simply cannot counter. Beneath the strategic failures of generals and the technical flaws of machinery lies the most profound shift of all, the human angle. For the average American GI shivering in a flooded, muddy foxhole, the Tunisian winter of 1943 is a brutal psychological awakening. They arrived in North Africa carrying the invincible sunny optimism of a nation that had not fought a major ground war in 24 years. They were told the Axis forces would crumble before the righteous might and endless supply lines of American industry. The reality of the high desert violently strips away this innocence. The green American soldier is suddenly plunged into an environment of extreme sensory horror. The relentless shrieking wail of the Jericho trumpets mounted on Junkers Ru-87, Stuka dive bombers tearing out of the low clouds paralyzes entire platoons. The sheer concussive force of German artillery turns the rocky North African soil into deadly flying shrapnel. For the very first time, these young men from farms in Iowa and factories in Ohio watch their friends vaporized in a flash of high explosives. They see the pristine tanks they so proudly maintained reduced to blackened, smoking tombs with their crews still trapped inside. Fear quickly replaces bravado. The American soldier realizes that the enemy does not care about American industrial might, nor do they fear the American uniform. The German infantryman is a professional killer who moves with terrifying, silent discipline, exploiting every mistake and every moment of hesitation. The psychological shock is absolute. At Kasserine Pass, this shock manifests in undeniable mass panic. Men drop their M1 Garand rifles, abandon their heavy equipment, and run blindly into the freezing rain to escape the mechanical slaughter. It is the lowest point in the history of the United States Army in the 20th century. They are humiliated, battered, and bleeding in the dirt. But this brutal baptism is also a crucible. The American soldier is stripped of his naive illusions, leaving only a raw, desperate instinct to survive. The amateur army has been shattered. What rises from the ashes of Kasserine requires a fundamentally different kind of leader, a commander who understands that survival in this new war requires an entirely new level of focused violence. That focused violence arrives on March 6, 1943, in the form of Major General George S. Patton, Jr. He steps out of his command car at the 2nd Corps headquarters in Jebel Quif, a cloud of fine desert dust settling around his meticulously polished cavalry boots. He does not bring words of comfort for a battered army. He brings cold, calculated wrath. The United States, the 2nd Corps, is a broken instrument. Patton immediately sets out to forge it into a weapon of war. He recognizes that the disaster at Kasserine was not merely a failure of equipment, but a fundamental failure of discipline. Within hours of taking command, he institutes draconian regulations. Every soldier, from rear echelon mechanics to frontline infantrymen, must wear their heavy M1 steel helmets at all times. Neckties are mandatory in the combat zone. Uniforms must be pristine and sleeves rolled down. Severe financial fines are issued mercilessly for the slightest infraction. To the exhausted, traumatized G's, these rules initially seem like the absurd, tyrannical demands of a parade ground martinet. But Patton is not interested in their comfort or their affection. He understands a grim psychological truth of modern combat. Men who are not disciplined in the small, mundane things will inevitably break in the face of machine-gun fire. He is systematically, aggressively eradicating the casual, sloppy civilian mindset that led to the slaughter in February. The bunker mentality of the previous command is instantly abolished. Patton orders all command posts move directly behind the front lines. Subordinate officers are forced out of their tents and ordered to the forward trenches. Those who show hesitation, pessimism, or a lack of aggressive instinct are quietly but swiftly stripped of their commands and sent to the rear. Patton stalks the encampments, his famous ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips, his high-pitched voice a constant, demanding presence. He instills a singular, terrifying mandate into the blood of his officers. Americans do not surrender, and Americans do not retreat. Across the lines, the German High Command remains dangerously oblivious to this rapid, seismic shift in American military culture. Erwin Rommel, suffering from severe desert sores and physical exhaustion, has been recalled to Germany. Command of the Axis forces in the sector falls to Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim, buoyed by the overwhelming triumph at Kasserine Pass. Von Arnim and his veteran officers still view the United States, the 2nd Corps, as a fragile, incompetent militia. They believe the American spirit is fundamentally broken. The German operational plan assumes that one more heavy, concentrated armored thrust will shatter the American lines permanently, driving them back into Algeria and securing the Axis flank. By mid-March, the reformed American forces begin to move. They advance eastward, back toward the jagged mountain passes they had fled just weeks before. But this is not the same disorganized mob. Their marching columns are tight. Their radio traffic is strictly disciplined and coded. Their anti-tank guns are expertly sighted and heavily camouflaged. They push aggressively toward a strategically vital oasis town nestled in a wide, flat valley surrounded by harsh peaks, El Guettar. On March 16th, the United States 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, under the command of Major General Terry Allen, secures the high ground overlooking the El Guettar Valley. They do not repeat the fatal mistakes of the past. They do not scatter their forces. They dig in deep, constructing heavily fortified, overlapping fields of fire. American artillerymen sight their 105mm howitzers perfectly, registering every likely avenue of approach on the valley floor below. Night falls on March 22, 1943. The desert air grows freezing cold. Hidden in the darkness of the eastern Dorsale, the mechanized heart of the German 10th Panzer Division begins to beat. Over 100 tanks, supported by thousands of veteran motorized infantry, assemble for a massive pre-dawn assault. They expect to roll over the American lines with the same terrifying, effortless ease they experienced a month prior. The German commanders are supremely confident, expecting the green troops to panic, to abandon their guns, and to run at the first sound of the heavy tracks. But the men waiting for them in the dark are no longer the frightened farm boys of February. They are soldiers who have learned to hate, commanded by generals who demand a wall of steel. That wall of steel is tested at precisely 0600 hours on the morning of March 23, 1943. Valley floor of El Guettar trembles. Through the dissipating morning mist, the vanguard of the 10th Panzer Division emerges. It is a terrifying, synchronized wave of over 50 German tanks, trailed by hundreds of motorized infantrymen in armored half-tracks. The German commanders, standing tall in their turret cupolas, scan the American lines. They expect the familiar signs of panic, the sudden abandonment of positions, the chaotic retreat. They smile at the memory of Kasserine, anticipating another effortless victory over an inferior foe. But the men of the United States 1st Infantry Division do not run. They grip their M1 Garand rifles in the freezing mud of their foxholes. They wait. As the German armor rolls into the designated kill zone, the American trap violently springs shut. The lead panzers strike a meticulously laid American minefield. The dull, thunderous crump of high explosives rips the tracks from the German machines, instantly halting their momentum. This is the exact moment the American artillery spotters on the high ground have been waiting for. From behind the ridge lines, entire battalions of American 105mm and 155mm howitzers open fire simultaneously. The barrage is apocalyptic. Thousands of high explosive shells scream out of the morning sky, transforming the valley floor into a boiling cauldron of smoke, shrapnel, and churning earth. The precise, concentrated fire obliterates the trailing German infantry, separating them from their armored support. The surviving German panzers desperately attempt to maneuver out of the artillery barrage, seeking targets. Instead, they are met by a new lethal American response. The United States Army introduces the M10 tank destroyer to the North African theater. It is an open-topped, lightly armored vehicle built for a single purpose: killing tanks. Armed with a high-velocity 3-inch gun, the M10s sit completely camouflaged in defilade positions. They wait until the panzers expose their vulnerable flanks. Then they fire. The heavy, armor-piercing rounds punch cleanly through the Krupp steel of the Panzer Division. German tanks brew up in massive pillars of oily black smoke. Turrets are blown clear off their chassis. The German commanders, accustomed to the harmless deflection of the 37mm American guns, are caught in a state of absolute shock. Their invincible armor is being systematically dismantled. By 0900 hours, the initial German assault is completely broken. Over 30 panzers lie burning in the valley. The Afrika Korps is forced to initiate a tactical withdrawal, leaving their dead and dying in the sand. But the German High Command refuses to accept that the Americans have bested them. At 1600 hours, they launch a second, desperate offensive. This time, they commit their reserve infantry, supported by relentless, screaming dive-bombing runs from Junkers Route 87 Stukas. The American lines shudder under the concussive weight of the aerial bombardment. Telephone wires are severed. Command posts are buried in dirt, yet the line holds. The American infantrymen refuse to yield an inch of ground. When the German infantry charges, they are met with a coordinated, devastating wall of machine gun fire and point-blank artillery airbursts. The American gunners fire over 30,000 artillery shells in a single day, melting the barrels of their howitzers. The German attack simply disintegrates under the sheer, unyielding volume of American firepower. As the sun sets on March 23rd, a profound, chilling silence falls over the valley. The turning point has arrived. The Americans have not only absorbed the heaviest blow the Afrika Korps can deliver, but they have actively shattered it. The next morning, George S. Patton issues a new order. The time for defensive posturing is over. The American military doctrine violently shifts from static survival to relentless aggression. The men of the Second Corps climb out of their foxholes. Supported by overwhelming artillery and the lethal new tank destroyers, entire divisions advance without hesitation directly into the teeth of the German defenses, pushing the Axis forces backward toward the sea. The myth of German invincibility and American cowardice is permanently buried in the Tunisian sand, paving the way for a brutal mathematical conclusion to the North African campaign. The mathematical conclusion begins on the smoking valley floor of El Guettar. The morning sun of March 24th illuminates a graveyard of German steel. Over 30 Panzer Kampfwagen (IVS) lie gutted across the rocky terrain, their turrets blown askew, thick black smoke spiraling into the clear North African sky. Mixed among the ruined armor are the shattered remnants of elite motorized infantry units. American soldiers, the same men who had fled in terror just 5 weeks earlier, now walk slowly through the carnage. They step over the bodies of fallen Afrika Korps veterans. They collect discarded Lugers and Mauser rifles not as desperate scavengers, but as victorious souvenirs. The psychological transformation is complete. The paralyzing fear of the blitzkrieg has evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened confidence. The sheer speed of this American evolution is unprecedented. In a span of merely 35 days, the United States Second Corps had abandoned its flawed, static defensive doctrines. Under Patton's ruthless hand, they had learned to consolidate their strength, abandoning the isolated hilltop deployments that had doomed them at Sidi Bouzid. They had mastered the art of the active defense, utilizing the deadly M10 tank destroyers in devastating shoot-and-scoot ambushes. Most importantly, the American artillery had proven itself to be the undisputed king of battle. The ability of U.S. gunners to coordinate massive time-on-target barrages, where hundreds of shells from different batteries arrive at a specific coordinate at the exact same second, shattered the cohesion of the German assault forces. Miles away in Tunis, the mood inside Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim's headquarters is one of profound creeping dread. The field reports filtering back from the 10th Panzer Division are initially met with outright disbelief. German commanders demand the casualty and equipment loss figures be recounted. It is incomprehensible to the seasoned Prussian officers that a supposedly soft, unteachable force, shattered so completely at Kasserine Pass, could absorb a concentrated armored assault and utterly destroy the attackers, but the telemetry is undeniable. The German High Command is forced to confront a terrifying reality. The United States military is not a rigid, clumsy militia. It is a highly adaptable, industrial juggernaut, capable of learning the bloody lessons of modern warfare at an astonishingly fast pace. The arrogance that defined the German officer corps in February is entirely dead. In its place is the grim realization that they have awakened a sleeping giant that now knows exactly how to fight. With the American Second Corps advancing relentlessly from the west, the strategic geometry of North Africa collapses for the Axis. The British Eighth Army, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, breaks through the heavily fortified Meurith line to the south, driving north with overwhelming force. Erwin Rommel's former army is effectively caught in a massive, crushing vice. The vital supply ports of Tunis and Bizerte are now within striking distance of Allied bombers and long-range artillery. Logistics, the lifeblood of the Desert War, begin to dry up completely for the German and Italian forces. Fuel becomes desperately scarce, forcing tank crews to abandon perfectly functional panzers in the dunes. Ammunition is strictly rationed. The Luftwaffe, outmatched and heavily outnumbered by American P-38 Lightnings and British Spitfires, loses control of the skies. This leaves the retreating Axis columns entirely exposed to merciless round-the-clock aerial strafing. The hunter has explicitly become the hunted, cornered against the shores of the Mediterranean Sea with no hope of evacuation, setting the stage for a catastrophic and inevitable collapse of the entire Axis presence in Africa. That inevitable collapse accelerates through the spring of 1943. The Allied ring tightens around the final Axis bridgehead in northern Tunisia. In early May, a massive coordinated offensive combining the weight of the British 1st and 8th Armies with the revitalized American 2 Corps shatters the last defensive lines outside Tunis and Bizerte. The skies are entirely dominated by Allied aircraft, flying relentless sorties that pound the retreating columns into dust. The Mediterranean, once a vital artery for German supply ships, is now effectively an Allied lake. Blockaded by the Royal Navy, there will be no Dunkirk for the Afrika Korps. On May 12th, the resistance completely crumbles. The capitulation is staggering in its scale. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers lay down their arms. It is a surrender that rivals the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad just months prior. Among the captured are the most seasoned, elite veterans of the Desert War, including Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim himself. The very men who had smiled at the American blunders at Kasserine now march silently into prisoner-of-war camps, their uniforms ragged, their myth of invincibility shattered. General Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied ground forces, sends a succinct, verifiable telegram to Winston Churchill. "Sir, it is my duty to report that the Tunisian campaign is over. All enemy resistance has ceased. We are masters of the North African shores. For the United States Army, the aftermath of North Africa extends far beyond the capture of territory. It is a fundamental rewriting of their military DNA. The War Department ruthlessly dissects the failures of February and the triumphs of March. The doctrine of using tanks purely for infantry support is permanently discarded. Armored divisions are reorganized to balance tanks, mechanized infantry, and self-propelled artillery, allowing them to fight as cohesive, independent strike forces. The M3 Lee, a technological dead end, is phased out entirely in favor of mass-producing the M4 Sherman, which, while still vulnerable to the 88mm gun, proves mechanically superior and infinitely more adaptable. The concept of the tank destroyer is validated in the short term, though the true lesson learned is the absolute necessity of combined arms warfare. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air support can no longer operate in isolated silos. They must function as a single devastating organism. Commanders who cannot adapt to this high-speed, synchronized violence are systematically replaced by men who can. Officers like Omar Bradley and Georges Patton rise to the forefront, proving that aggressive, frontline leadership is the only antidote to the chaos of mechanized combat. The farm boys and factory workers who survived the agonizing crucible of the Tunisian desert are no longer untested civilians playing at war. They are hardened, cynical, and highly lethal veterans. The blood spilled in the desert sand has forged the foundation of a relentless machine that is finally prepared to cross the Mediterranean and strike at the very heart of Fortress Europe. To strike at Fortress Europe required more than just the boundless industrial might of the United States. It demanded a fundamental transformation of the human spirit. The North African campaign remains one of the most vital, yet often overshadowed, Chapters in the history of the Second World War. It was the brutal, necessary bridge between the sterile, theoretical warfare of peacetime maneuvers and the blood-soaked reality of the 20th century. Before the windswept defeats at Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine Pass, the American military relied heavily on the sheer mathematics of production. They believed that outproducing the enemy would naturally equate to outfighting them. The veteran German Afrika Korps violently disproved that theory. They demonstrated, with terrifying efficiency, that the finest equipment and the most abundant supply lines are rendered completely useless without the hardened resolve of the men wielding them and the ruthless competence of the officers directing the battle. The men who arrived in Tunisia in the winter of 1942 were inherently optimistic. They carried the naive belief that the conflict would be a swift, relatively painless march to victory. The veterans who stood over the smoldering wreckage at El Guettar in the spring of 1943 knew the dark, unforgiving truth. They had looked directly into the abyss of modern mechanized slaughter, experienced the paralyzing depths of fear, and learned the incredibly difficult lesson of how to push forward anyway. The German smiles, once so prevalent among the high command when reading reports of American blunders, permanently faded in the dust of the Tunisian desert. They were replaced by the chilling realization that they had not broken the American will. They had inadvertently forged it. The arsenal of democracy was no longer just a collection of factories in Michigan or shipyards in California. It was now a living, breathing entity, commanded by seasoned soldiers who would not stop, who would not break, and who would march relentlessly from the shores of Sicily to the heart of Berlin. This was the true, agonizing birth of the modern United States Army, shattered in defeat, tempered in the scorching desert heat, and finally unleashed upon a world at war.